Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. I'm very pleased to give you a warm welcome to one of the last sessions of these 3 days of global exchange and reflection about the future of learning. Digital education for a strong recovery and look forward. My name is Cristóbal Cobo. I'm a senior education specialist at the World Bank, and I will be the moderator of this session. Today, we will discuss COVID-19, lessons for digital education, lessons from the past to reinvent the future. This 60-minute session is co-hosted by the World Bank, and I have a great news for you. We have 3 remarkable panelists. Lucia Delagnello, President and CEO of the Center of Innovation for the Brazilian Education, CIEB. Leda Milena Muñoz García, Executive Director from Fundación Omar Dengo in Costa Rica, and Fernando Reimers, Professor and Director of the Global Education Innovation Initiative and of the International Education Policy Master Program at the Harvard University in the United States. To all of you, very welcome. We have today 214 million students who have missed more than 3/4 of the school year of their in-person learning. There's so much to discuss, but also there's so much to do. This is arguably one of the most disruptive moments of education in our era. Did technologies deliver as expected? Did teachers respond? What support did countries provide to the teachers? What we have learned and what we haven't learned yet? Why we still have this huge digital divide, but also a huge gender gap? What are the learning losses of this time, but also what are the learning gains? And what can we expect for the future? Will March 2020 be massively different to March 2022? We will explore some introductory questions with the panelists, and we also invite all the participants to share comments and questions in the chat. In the right-hand side of your screen, you will find the discussion tab, where you can exchange experiences and comments with the rest. And also, you will find the question tab. And we really encourage you to share some of these questions, and we will make the best of the time in order to bring some of these questions to the panelists. So, if you allow me, let me start with Fernando in order to jump directly into the conversation. Fernando, as you know very well, Harvard University, the OECD, 100 organization, and the World Bank for the last 12 months or so, we have developed these continuity stories, which are case studies of countries and organizations and how they've been coping with the crisis. And you have written several of those. Would you mind to highlight some of the takeaways from that work on education continuity stories?
I'm happy to do that, Cristóbal. But let me first say that I so appreciate that you and the OECD have organized these 3 days to take stock of where we are, what we have learned, and even more importantly, what do we need to do going forward? Because, not to mince words, we are facing the most significant education crisis in the history of humanity. And if we don't do anything, this is going to seriously complicate the world in ways that are difficult to anticipate. I mean, I'll be blunt. The pandemic of 1918 gave rise to Hitler in Germany. And I think as we look at the challenges, the political challenges happening anywhere, from the United States to Nigeria, to Peru, to Colombia, to Canada, the risks are real for societies. And so I think that we really don't have an option but to address what it will take in education and in other spheres to convey to people that a better future is possible. And as part of that, taking stock of what we have learned in this crisis is essential. So I'm grateful that you're doing this. I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate in the conversation. And I believe that this kind of stock-taking exercise is essential, because I think that the only way we're going to come out of this crisis is if we have 3 resources. The first one is unquestioned social commitment to restoring educational opportunity. Second, innovation, innovation, innovation. This is not just about going back to where we were. This is about leaping forward into a much better education system that not only restores what was lost, but that actually remedies the serious challenges and deficits of our education system prior to the pandemic, and that readies students for a more complicated world, where the first thing we have to do is help a lot of people find jobs in economies that are changing, and we have to address the increased violence, social fragmentation, political divisions that have been worsened by the pandemic, not to speak about climate change. And the third resource we're going to need is leadership. Leadership everywhere, in classrooms, in schools, in systems, in universities, and so on. So to go back to the 100 cases, as you know well this story, when I reached out to Andrea Schleicher back in March of last year, and I said, I'm concerned about what's happening, what can we do? The first thing we did were not the case studies. The first thing we did was a survey that we administered to colleagues in 100 countries. And the story was terrible because most people that we surveyed anticipated the crisis we have seen. And then we said, we need to do better than that. We need to help people figure out what to do. And that was the origin of the case studies. That's when we reached out to the organization 100, we reached out to the World Bank, and we said, let's do that. And we have produced about 100 of them. And I'm very pleased that we did that. I think they were somewhat helpful. So what did we learn from the case studies in particular? Well, I'd say the first thing we learned is that there were tremendous efforts to innovate and to do that very quickly, that there was actually a lot of resourcefulness, and there was a lot of capacity already to deploy technologies, even simple technologies, to do the best that people could do on short notice to try to mitigate the fact that we had shut down schools. And I think that's good. I think that's good to discover that in a very short period of time, it was possible for ordinary teachers, for schools, for organizations of civil society, for local municipal governments, state governments, and nations to use these technologies to do things they hadn't done before. That's a good lesson. So I think we need to understand what supported that. And I think the two takeaways from the cases, which I know are collaboration. Collaboration stimulated creativity and partnerships across schools and between schools and other institutions. In particular, partnerships between public sector and the private sector. It's important to mention that because I think that as we look forward, one of the things we're going to have to consider is how do we rethink the regulatory framework, which was not designed, of course, to promote innovation. It was designed to control, to produce accountability. But I think the regulatory framework in many places at this moment is an obstacle to innovation. So I think it's very important that we examine part of what happened in the emergency. To give you an example, in a country like Finland, the nation state has no business in education. It's a decentralized system. But Finland understood if we don't intervene, if we don't enact emergency powers, which they hadn't enacted since World War II, we're going to see an increase in inequalities. So they did what Brazil didn't do, what Mexico didn't do. And in those cases, the central state was missing in action. And the consequence of that was tremendous increase in inequality and the weakest places completely unassisted from the kind of support that the central state provided in Finland, even though the regulatory framework didn't allow it. So I think looking forward, we're going to have to look for what are the conditions that make it possible for that unprecedented level of collaboration and for those new partnerships to augment the capacity of the education system and of schools to innovate. I think we also learned that there's tremendous goodwill on the part of everyone involved in education to sustain the right of education. If there is one lesson that I learned, is that most of the context examined in these case studies are contexts where people understood that education is important. Maybe not as important as jobs or health in the context of a pandemic, but maybe the third thing. Those are great news. But I think we also have to be frank. We learned that in spite of all the efforts, in spite of all these initiatives, in spite of this unprecedented mobilization, we could not avert what I think will prove to be the biggest loss in educational opportunity. And the loss in educational opportunity, it's important to remember, it's not a single story. This is very much a tale of two cities. I have just completed with colleagues a large comparative study of what happened in this pandemic in 13 different countries around the world. And the story is very different in a country like Portugal, where the federal government from day one made equality of opportunity the driving criteria in how to face this pandemic. or in a context like Norway and Finland, which had actually invested in the development of digipedagogies before the pandemic, and which were able to make a very seamless transition to these modalities, in contrast to countries like South Africa, like Brazil, like Chile, like Mexico, like the United States, which had not made those investments and which had tremendous inequalities and differences in capacity to begin with, and where those inequalities, both educational and social, augmented the gaps in opportunity. And the truth is that you take like a country like Chile with huge social inequalities, and when the home becomes the place of learning, all these inequalities get augmented. If there is one thing that this pandemic taught us, is that in those settings, the public school, with all its imperfections, is a much better place to level the playing field than the home. So I think those are some of the learnings. I do think, however, it's very important to commit to solving this problem. I don't think this is a moment to contemplate the misery, to contemplate the crisis. We should talk about the crisis because it's real and because it may fuel the commitment that we need. But the task ahead is a task of saying, okay, so how are we going to catch up and leap forward?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. This is such a compelling way of getting into the discussion. Lucia, you have a large experience working in Brazil, and this is such an interesting country with such a diversity within the country. Based on what you have seen these last months, and I heard that you have been providing a lot of technical support to different organizations in the country. What do you think digital technologies, to what extent they help the schools and the teachers to overcome the pandemic? What is your analysis of these months? What has been the role that technology has played?
Hi, hello everyone. Well, first I agree with Fernando. I think we have to say that technology, digital technology, were used in a very unequal and inadequate way. Some teachers just used digital technology to teach in a very traditional way, which was not good for engagement and for learning. So I think we have a lot of experiences now, and some of these experiences we want to incorporate in the education, and some others we just need to discard because they were not good experiences in the use of technology. And of course, there was problems in providing education through digital technology, and there was the problem of access. As being said, the inequality of students in Brazil was very, very big, and some students spent the whole school year last year without having any educational activity because they didn't have access. But there is one good side, that digital technology helped teachers to maintain the communications between them, principals and schools, and with families and students. So I think that was the major role that technology played during the pandemic, was keeping people communicating with each other, and trying to establish at least this the commitment that school departments and schools had with their students. But we have to be very serious about what I call this now taking stock, but also trying to have a critical look for the use of technology in education. A lot of people are saying that these responses that use technology were an introduction of technology in education, in public education, but I don't like to think that. We have to be very critical and analyze the results and see that some ways of using technology are not appropriate and they are not conducive to learning. The good part of this experience in using technology is that teachers realized that they need more training in how to incorporate technology in their teaching. That is not just being fluent in the use of technology is not enough to enhance the teaching profession with technology. So at least in Brazil, I see that teachers are now very aware that they need to develop these competencies, and they are looking for ways, and they're demanding training, both in university, initial training, but also from departments of education. So I think there was a good, we could take good results from this massive use of technology, but again, we have to have a critical look and look to the ways and research and see the ways that are inadequate for the use of technology. I think it was a paradox, as the more we use technology, the more we realize how important face-to-face moments are for learning. So teachers need to develop this capacity now of doing educational pedagogical planning, being able to design experiences where we take the best of technology, but at the same time to put technology aside and to make the most of these face-to-face moments in schools.
Thank you so much. I love the paradox that you're highlighting. It's such an important one. Let me get back to Leda. Leda is leading an organization which is very known for decades, enabling a proper integration of technology into education, but also with a larger approach. And as the rest of the panelists have highlighted, it's not only about technology, a number of other conditions. So based on your experience, Leda, are education systems in Latin America, or perhaps broadly in low and middle income countries, preparing learners for the future? Is it only about technology? There are other components that you think are important to consider.
Well, okay, that's a very good question, Sam. You know, what we can predict about the future, we have no idea what technologies will be there. So in the Omar Dengo Foundations, we are trying to work with students in two ways, that they learn with technologies, as we just talking about, but also that they learn about technologies. I think that the only way that they could face the future, all the technologies, the AI, everything that will probably come, is having an understanding of, a basic understanding at least, of how machines work. So we are working with students. We have a program with over 500,000 students, learning to code, learning to program, learning about robotics, learning about big data, but also learning about computational thinking as a cognitive core of the program. I think that's the best way you can prepare students for the future, is to understand how machines work, and to have a good manage of the basic languages, which is, you know, programming to code. So those are the two things that we are trying to develop or implement through our programs. And in doing so, and that's the very interesting thing, and in doing so, when kids learn to program and they work on projects to make a solution for a problem, they are developing cognitive skills that are critical, like problem solving, like critical thinking, like collaboration. You are stimulating creativity and innovation. So it's like a good side effect. You know, you are hitting thinking skills, and at the same time you are providing the language and the conceptual framework to understand the future.
That's fantastic, and thank you so much for bringing us the opportunity to go beyond the instrumental use and thinking more in this literacy and capacities. We don't get stuck with the transformation of technology. This is great. Let me get back to Fernando. We have highlighted some of the positive effects for some of the things that we see have been working, but one of the remaining questions from policymakers and the community interested in this field is what needs to be improved? What are the things that we have to rethink completely? What are the new approaches that we have to bring into the conversation?
Well, I think that the first thing we need to change are our mindsets about what is the right scale at which this enormous challenge of innovation can be solved. If there is one thing the pandemic showed us, is that the unit of the school, in particular many schools, is too small a unit to solve this problem. And one of the big takeaways of the pandemic is that as teachers and principals were struggling to find ways to continue to educate, they realized two things: the necessity to create unprecedented levels of collaboration within the school, but also to augment the capacity of the school, connecting schools with networks in other schools and with other institutions. I have recently finished a study with colleagues looking at how 20 universities around the world, in the context of the pandemic, partnered with education systems, with networks of schools, for the purpose of helping them develop the innovations that they needed to continue to educate. And it's a very powerful story. The reality is that the 30,000 or so universities around the world have much more capacity than most schools, than even the best endowed schools. So if we can find a way to shift the unit of analysis from the single school to something called a network of schools, enhanced by either an organization such as the organizations that Lucia and Leda work in, or universities or other NGO, I think we have a better hope, a better chance of producing the innovation. The task of innovation, the task of research and development, the task of engineering needs people with the training, with the skills to do that. And for the most part, schools are not organized. I'm not saying that teachers shouldn't be part of those efforts, but they need assistance, they need help. And I'm skeptical that ministries of education are the best places to develop that. I don't think that ministries have been designed historically to promote innovation. They've been designed to bring things to scale. They've been designed to deliver services to big numbers. But innovation, I frankly think, is better done in institutions that are designed for that purpose, that are freed from some of the constraints of a public bureaucracy, frankly, and from some of the capture that sometimes happen in public bureaucracies to political interests. Not to say that there aren't political interests in universities, but we understand that capture, that advancing partisan interest in universities undermines the mission in university in a way that is not always understood in a ministry of education, for example. So one of the things I think is necessary is to build these collaboratives and to change the level of analysis. The second one is to review the regulatory framework. Regulatory frameworks exist, again, for good reasons. We have to protect public resources, and we have to be accountable to the public for the use of those resources. So regulatory frameworks too often are more about accountability and guarding than they are about promoting innovation. When you hear organizations that are about innovation, the mantra of Mark Zuckerberg is move fast and break things fast, or something like that. So the culture of the place is, don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness if you have to, but take initiative. And that's not the mindset necessarily that regulatory frameworks induce. And so I think this is a moment to revise. One of the things we learned in the pandemic, for example, is that in many systems, an hour of online instruction doesn't count. So, and this was true for universities and for schools and for teacher training institutions. Teachers have to do a certain number of hours of practice, and only face-to-face practice counted. Well, systems had to realize you had to change those regulations to the times. I'm hoping that now that we have changed them, we will realize some of the benefits of those changes. Frankly, I think that's why I said that the three key resources to move forward are innovation, leadership, and commitment. Because without leadership, my prediction is that everything that we know about the study of the process of educational change would lead to say, if I had to bet money, is we're not going to seize the innovation dividend. We're going to go back. We're going to go back. Every study of massive efforts of change say these systems go back to their homeostasis, to what they were doing, to what people know how to do. In fact, I'm concerned that this experience in innovation might actually cause some people, realizing the many things that went wrong, paradoxically, on the one hand, to be more curious and to want to learn more, but also to be more conservative and to say, no, we know that online didn't work for all the kids, let's go back to the public school. So that's why we're going to need leadership. We're going to need leadership, and we're going to have to revise the norms so that we can make it possible to build these collaborations. Even collaboration, for example, one of the great things that the government of Chile did is the president met with the rectors of the two main universities. And he said, I need your help. And they built something, I forget what was called, the COVID table. And the idea was, this is the time when the nation needs you to come up with ideas for how we're going to handle the public health emergency. And great things happen as a result of that. One of those universities, the Catholic University, for example, began to get much more involved in schools than they had been prior. And the rector in several speeches said, I'm hoping that this is not just going to be something we do in the pandemic. I realize now that to have a school of education that is divorced from reality makes no sense in ordinary times. So I think that these are some of the things we're going to need to do. I also hope that we will understand that the way, Lucia referred to that, the way in which we use technology was in an emergency setting. To me, the analogy of this pandemic is a war. In a war with very little time, when the ship was sinking, we grabbed what we could. We can do much better than that in terms of building capacity, in terms of building uses. And we need to be mindful that even though we have just gone through probably the largest global experiment in scaling the use of technology, it is not the experiment that anyone who knows anything about the potential of technology would have designed. And so, yes, I think we should become more humble. In retrospect, some of the things that were being promised about the potential of technology now look like very irresponsible things. I'm sure we're all familiar with this famous talk by Sugata Mitra that basically said, sure, let's get rid of the public schools. If we give a laptop to a poor child in Mumbai, they will teach themselves what they need. Boy, now that sounds very much like the lie that it is, an irresponsible lie, dismissing completely the in-person education on the basis of unfounded promises. So I think that humility is a good humility. But by the same token, we should also understand that there are better ways to use technology. And frankly, I'm hoping that one of the things we're going to do going forward is we're going to realize that we need to accelerate access, certainly to connectivity and devices, but to the skills to use technology to educate and to function. That in this day and age, digital literacy is like access to clean water. It's like access to electricity. You cannot participate in society in any meaningful way if you don't have those skills. And if the pandemic has made one thing clear, is that is the big divide. That is the biggest divide that we have right now, and we have to solve it. And I think the way to solve it is by doing sound uses, sound design, sound engineering. That's why we need intervention about building blended systems. I don't think I have learned anything in this pandemic that tells me we should be prepared to abandon the public school. I think we have learned that there are all kinds of benefits to in-person instruction in terms of leveling the playing field. But I think we can make those in-person institutions a lot more effective than they are with intelligent use of technology. We can blend digitalization of education into that. Let me stop there.
That's fantastic. Leda, you rose your hand. Do you want to say something?
Yes, I just wanted to add two things. I am 100% with you in the idea that schools and teachers provide other layers of social benefits. And I am 100% with your proposal that the ministers of education are not probably the best place to cultivate innovation, and these partnerships with innovation hubs are very, very important. I think the ministers of education need to be humble enough to understand that they need to partner with others. And that also implies changing the regulatory frame. I'm 100% with you in those ideas, but I think there's one that I will add to your proposal. And I think teachers need to be innovators. I think students need to see in the teachers an innovator, a culture of innovation that should be there from preschool level. So that takes us to, well, how to prepare teachers for this new framework of education, where you need to be an innovator and where you have to develop digital skills that are specialized digital skills, that are skills for education to promote cognitive development, not any skills. And those two are very important challenges that involves the Ministry of Education, but also the universities that prepare teachers. That's it.
That's great. Thank you very much. Let me connect with this idea and get back to Lucia. Lucia, you said something that really resonates to me. There's other kind of inequality, not only between the have and the informations have and the informations have not, but also between those who have access to innovative practice and those who use technology only to replicate the more traditional models. So what is the advice that you would give to policymakers to move the needle, to reduce the inequalities with technology, or in some ways to integrate the technology also to benefit those who might be left behind?
Yeah, I agree. Very important points that Leda brought. And I think we have to prepare teachers to know how to integrate technology in their profession, which means know how technology can be integrated in the teaching learning process. But I'm now working with different organizations in Brazil to try to design two different strategies. One is that we have to create the infrastructure in schools now to provide after school time or a safe place for learning, what we are calling for the most vulnerable students, the ones that we know that don't have a place, sometimes don't have a table and a chair and a quiet place in their homes to study. So schools should become these learning hubs for those students that can't find that at home. And of course, we have to include in our welfare and cash transfers programs some money for internet connectivity. Our last research shows that almost 50 million Brazilians don't have access to internet. And when you ask them the reasons why they don't have, 1/3 says that they don't have money to contract to hire. 1/3 lives in areas that don't have the service. But what worries me the most is the 1/3 that says that they don't see the need for having internet. They don't know how to use it, and they don't feel the need to hire internet. So I think there is another level of inequality. Those citizens that don't perceive internet as important for their daily lives. So these are people that are probably outside the workplace or the work market that don't enjoy all the opportunities that internet and connectivity can bring for their professional and personal development. So what we are trying to work and design in Brazil is a double strategy, one that provides schools with these spaces. We are calling it spaces for innovation, where teachers and students, the most vulnerable students, can go and use and have access to digital technology, and providing additional funds for families to acquire internet whenever they are. And just to go back to one point that Fernando and Leda said about the importance of having these innovation centers to education in different countries. Before creating CIEB in Brazil, CIEB is a very new organization. We are only 5 years old. We did a benchmark of the centers of innovation. And so we visit Ceibal, CARIS in South Korea, Digital Promise in the United States, Kennisnet in the Netherlands, Rica in Estonia. And we could see how important it is to have a center of innovation thinking about innovative policies to be incorporated in the public policy. And I agree with Fernando that universities could be this learning and innovation center, but the tradition that we have, at least in Brazil, but I see in other countries in Latin America, is that universities are very far away apart from the day-to-day functioning of public schools. So they have difficulties in really designing public policies that could be readily implemented. But I totally agree that it's worth the effort to bring universities close to public schools in order to create these innovation centers or learning hubs that could design new public policies regarding the use of technology and innovation in general.
That is fantastic. And I think Fernando and I are privileged to be in the position to talk with you, because both of you are leaders of these innovation centers in Latin America. Innovation centers that we would love to see in other countries as well. And as you say, R&D, testing what is working, learning what is not working, exploring what changes are needed, consolidate institutional capacities, document these experiences. So I think CIEB and Fundación Omar Dengo, as others that you have mentioned as well, are really important to be replicated within higher education and also in other levels to have a larger cluster on that.
Can I say something on that
please
issue?
Go ahead.
Because I agree with Lucia when she says most universities don't. But I do think if we're pragmatic and we look for a way to scale these centers, that the university is the logical place in which to do that, not to mention the fact that we have 30,000 of them. Now, Brazil has some very good experience. 20 years ago, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Higher Education, invested in the creation of 5 centers of excellence in 5 state universities that would have a very defined mission with respect to the public education. So in the University of Minas Gerais, they created, in the University of Minas Gerais, they created a center specializing in language. In the University of Juiz de Fora, they created a center, CIEB, specialized in assessment. And if you look at what those centers have done, it's added tremendous value to the public education system. So I agree with Lucia that many universities have not yet understood that they have this potential, but I think that they are equipped, and that if it were up to me and I were to create a center, rather than create a place out of nowhere, I would house it in university, not necessarily in the School of Education, that's a separate issue, but I would house it in the university because, that's the place that was designed to advance knowledge and to advance research. I think it's a good home for a center like that. It doesn't mean that universities as they exist already have these places. Anyway, that's my.
Perfect. That's a great added. Leda, please.
One more thing.
Sure.
I am a professor at the university, and I think one of the weak things of universities is that they have a hard time of proposing things that can be scaled up, like at the whole national system of education. So in the case of Costa Rica, the Omar Dengo Foundation is kind of a bridge between this incredible, powerful innovation hub of the universities and the reality of the schools. For instance, we're working with a university now to develop an instrument to measure how kids are improving their programming skills. If there's a progression in the programming capacities of children, this has to be an instrument that you can do at a scale. It has to be, for thousands of students. So that scaling up is something that has been difficult for universities to work out. And I think that if they are going to, and we need them to enter more to help us with the innovation and the reforms that the educational system needs, they need to understand the special characteristics of scaling up a good idea.
Please go ahead, Lucia.
Just to add, I totally agree with Leda and Fernando. I agree with you that is a potential, but I don't see many examples working out right now regarding digital technology. If you see all the centers that I mentioned, for example, in Norway, Norwegian Center of Innovation for Education is not connected to university, but they are these bridging institutions between what is produced at university and the public, and the government and public policies. And it's funny because I changed my opinion. I used to think like you, that inside the university would be the right place to have it. But when I had the chance of working in the government, and I was a state secretary of education for 4 years, I understood that the mindset between universities and governments are very, very different. And maybe you need this translator, this bridge between the two different mindsets.
I hear you. This is the last thing I'll say. Maybe we need a separate forum on that issue. But when I look at how the public health and the medical aspect of this crisis have been managed, and the education crisis, it's a study in contrast. And I think the reason, and I would say the public health has been remarkable. I'm talking about the development of the vaccine. The fact that in months, we had several vaccines available is remarkable. And I think for the most part, the medical professionals who basically treated people did that very well. And what I see there is a well-integrated and coherent ecosystem that includes certainly hospitals, that includes laboratories within universities and in industry, working in close collaborations, that includes a pharmaceutical industry that can deliver. And I think it's that system that is missing in education. It is that system that made it possible for the public health and the medical industry to do something that most of us would have said was impossible last March, to have these vaccines. I mean, we now see we don't actually have the same system to deliver in many parts of the world, right? And so the issue is now no longer coming up with the idea, is delivering the vaccines in many places and so on. So I do think that as we talk about innovation and how do we help education leapfrog, part of what we need to think about is how do we build an actual system that is integrated. And I completely agree that the system that we have is completely broken into pieces. It's not a system. It's not a system. But I do know that this illusion that ministries with little schools dangling from the ministries is an illusion that maybe was adequate for the 18th century. It is not giving us the capacity, the institutional capacity to produce the reinvention. And I am somewhat skeptical that just adding an institute to that translate. Of course, I realize it's a huge leap forward in a context that is so broken. But I compare that to the systems that work like public health, and there is no here to there. There is no path. So I'm with you. I don't want to be the apologist for the university. In a moment, I'm going to talk to a group of 1,000 university presidents, and I'm going to talk to them about the challenges of universities. But I am trying to mobilize those institutions because they are there. You know, before this pandemic, sometimes people would say, but you defend the public school too much. And I said, yeah, because we have succeeded in building an institution that enrolls most kids. And it took us 7 decades. And I'm not prepared to be irresponsible and say, let's get rid of them and do something untested. And right now, I'm even more convinced that it's a good thing that we have these public schools for kids than I were. And so I extend the same analogy. We have succeeded at building a global infrastructure of 30,000 institutions called universities around the world. We have nothing comparable at the moment that can help us augment the capacity of the system. And I'm doubtful that we could build something of comparable scale in the near future, in the next several decades. So my view is that it's probably easier to re-engineer that system, to deploy that capacity in terms of augmenting the capacity of the system. That is to say, wouldn't it be wonderful if every country in the world could have a center like the one you have? But anyway, this may be a topic for another day.
No. This is absolutely aligned with the conversation. I think the whole idea is to look forward. And I think the reflections that you all have shared really help us to see, okay, this is the moment where we are. We have learned the limitations of education systems. And if we want to transform, to what extent the architectural, institutional capacities, the framework, as you mentioned, Fernando, are helping us to do these transformations. Probably will be top-down and bottom-up organizations and transformations, but in that sense, and in a landscape where more advanced technologies, data-intensive technologies, AI and other systems recognize voice, face, patterns of how we write and how we respond, there's increasing agreement on the kind of skills that we will require are going to massively change. And the question we have is, are the school systems prepared to do that? What are the transformations that policymakers will have to push? And I would like to ask Leda in that area, are teachers ready for this transformation, for this new set of skills? What kind of changes do we need? Do we have to bring the universities, other innovation hubs? What actions can we do? And hopefully in a near-term future, I mean, we cannot expect for 20 years transformation. We cannot sacrifice the generations that are today in school. Go ahead.
Well, the examples that Fernando was telling us of a good response to this extraordinary crisis, were places like Finland or Estonia or Singapore, where teachers are well prepared. I think that's the key issue. If we agree that school is an important place for all kids to meet and interact, and all the things that we've been saying, we need to have teachers ready for that new education, and they are not. Even in Costa Rica, that we've been working for such a long time, we've been really working as a program within the curricula. And the hope of the Omar Dengo Foundation 30 years ago was that it will somehow contaminate the whole curricula and the whole Ministry of Education and schools. And we haven't. Or contaminate the universities as getting teachers ready, and we have not. So I think that this the education has been given by the society historically the role of being conservative. They transmit values and history, and there's a culture of preserving things. So I think that the changes that need to be done have not been done far enough, deep enough, broad enough, even in countries like Costa Rica that have been working with these ideas. And my hope is that the crisis created this social awareness of how important education is, how important it is to help create a society that does not have the inequities that we have now, how important are our schools, how important is the teacher in this whole process, that we will do the leaping forward that Fernando is telling. I think we needed maybe not a crisis, but something to really push the agenda. And as I was saying at some point that we were talking, the social awareness of how important these things are, how much difficult has been for a teacher to connect with students that have no way of being included, of being connected, that the political class is getting finally interested in these issues. We have elections in Costa Rica in February for president, and all candidates are talking as very top priority about education, about connectivity as a universal right, as the networking of schools, things that we're talking now are finally as a priority in the political agenda. My hope is that this will really become action now. I mean, connectivity, we have in Costa Rica, we were okay in schools, but homes were terrible. A large percent of students at home did not have connectivity. And it was mainly, in our country, it was mainly because they didn't have the money to pay for the connectivity. Basically, that was the main limitation, because students been in contact with technology and with internet from preschool level. So they are aware how powerful that is for them. In Costa Rica, we have the technological capacity, we have the money to connect the far rural communities or the very low income communities in the whole country. We just need the leadership, as Fernando was saying, to make that a reality. And I think that the society is saying, enough, we need this.
That's great, fantastic, Leda, thank you. We have the last 10 minutes and the chat is overwhelmed by questions based on all the interesting exchanges that you have had. Let me start with Fernando. Someone is asking directly to you, what do you consider are the key stepping stones to have in place in order to facilitate this collaboration between the public and the private in order to create this ecosystem of innovation that you suggested?
Well, in a context like this one, the first one is to make sure that this is allowed. In many places, there are legal and regulatory barriers to make this possible. The second one is to just ask. One of the things that I learned from these case studies of innovation over the last year is that there is tremendous amount of goodwill and desire on the part of people to help. And sometimes what it takes is for someone to take this step. There are some places where there are mindsets, very ingrained attitudes that make it difficult. There are some places where the whole idea of participation of the private sector is colored ideologically in a way that makes it very difficult to have that collaboration. And I hope that a moment of crisis like the one we have would help all of us suspend beliefs and understand that we need all hands on deck if we're going to address this crisis. So these are some of the barriers. I think that this challenge of collective leadership, not an easy one. This notion that an education system is so complex that it takes a lot of moving pieces align and moving in the same direction. And that's difficult. In many places, the incentive structure is one where each of us is more inclined to mind our own business and to advance our own interests than to see the bigger picture and to see where we understand. This is often the case even with the nonprofit sector. You see places that have a myriad of little NGOs working in education, all competing because the incentive structure is they're all competing for what they believe is a limited pool of funding. And that is incredibly harmful. It produces a whole generation of people who are selected and rewarded on the basis of how they compete with others as opposed to how they can collaborate. And the truth is that all this competition hasn't gotten us very far. So I think that some of the steps that we need are regulatory. Again, leadership, just ask, assume the best, and develop mindsets that make it possible for people to understand how they fit in a bigger puzzle, that there is enough problem to go around and to be solved for everyone. So those are some of the things. I also think that it takes practice. It takes practice for people to develop new habits, and moments of crisis make it possible. One of the consequences of this pandemic is that it is producing greater social fragmentation. You may know that the National Intelligence Council in the United States, which brings together all of our main intelligence agencies and which every 4 years provides the new president a report on what are the main risks for the country in the medium term. The last report, the theme is social fragmentation. The third of that report is global factor. It says this is the main theme to our democracy. And I don't think this is the only country that is facing this challenge. So the education space was already fragmented enough before this pandemic. We can see that it is going to require leadership and a lot of goodwill to say, listen, we're all together in terms of wanting to have a country at the end of this thing. Nobody is interested in a place that looks like Venezuela today, where 11 armed groups essentially run what used to be a nation and no longer is a nation. And so that requires collective leadership. That requires people to understand that the whole is much more important than the parts, than each individual part. And a crisis can be a moment to produce that. I had the opportunity to work in El Salvador after 12 years of civil war, and to play a role bringing different parties together because the crisis made them realize that the alternatives were a lot worse. I'm hoping that this crisis had that effect. Anyway.
Thank you for this inspiring and promising view, Fernando. That's great. Let me get back to Lucia. There's, as I said, several questions, but I think one, you can bring a slide. The question is, how can innovation in pedagogies prevail in an education system that is very conservative and tend to be focused on accountability?
Yeah, that's a very important point, but I would like to give an example of what Fernando was talking about bringing together these different actors of the ecosystem of education. During the pandemic, we were able to do something that was thought to be impossible in Brazil, is to map the connectivity status of every single public school in Brazil. There were different databases from the government, from the big providers, the telephonic and internet companies, and didn't match. It was not possible really to have a clear picture. So what we did at CIEB, we invited all these players to the table and say, let's have one integrated look at the status of connectivity in Brazilian schools. And nowadays we have this map with data on 120,000 schools in Brazil. The ministry never had this data. The companies didn't have this data. And now we are able to map. And it took a lot of trust. That, I think, it's one word that we need to reinforce. We have to come out of this crisis with increased levels of trust in different sectors. Nobody's going to face the challenge that we are left in education without a lot of trust between the public, the private, the NGO sector. And I think we have at CIEB very good examples now that we are able to bring these different actors to the table and produce something that helped to solve the problem. So I think, you know, we have to bring this mindset of innovation to education. And the way of doing that is to bring in new actors, entrepreneurs, edtech entrepreneurs, university people that come from different areas, from different perspectives, and bring different perspectives to the same problems. And as I said, there was a lot of mistrust in education setting in Latin America, and I think we have to rebuild it in order to be able to overcome this crisis.
That's great. Thank you so much. Leda, you said earlier, teachers need to be innovators. And some people are asking here whether teachers will thrive only having digital skills or what other changes are required on the one side. And the other question is how to facilitate this at a scale in order to respond to the massive needs we have.
Well, training of teachers happens in my country at the university level. And we need to talk with universities a little bit more. I think they are, again, a little bit disconnected of what's happening at the school level, at the classroom level. Meanwhile, we have in Costa Rica almost 70,000 teachers on service, that they are there with whatever training they were able to get. And we need to develop a professional development program, an intelligent program that has clear objectives, progressions that are clear, and create the incentives to stimulate that progression. Because at least in my country, those incentives are not clear and very often work backwards. So partnership with organizations like the Omar Dengo Foundation that has scaling up programs for training of teachers is important. Partnership with other universities, with partners like we've been partnership with Lucia, are very important. It's the only way. And the third element is to get connectivity as a universal service. It's not enough, but it's a requirement. It's like the very basics on which you can start building all these layers that we need.
That's great. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but I will do the risky exercise of asking you to share a final idea in the last 2 minutes we have. TikTok, I think last 15 seconds, Twitter is in only 240 characters. So one idea, one sentence, and I apologize for that because there's a lot that will be missed, but one takeaway that you would like to share with the audience after to keep the conversation going. Fernando, would you like to start?
Happy to do it. I think one of the learnings that we all have experienced during the pandemic is that technologies like the one we're using today allow us to come together from different places, different ideas, different levels in the education system, and listen to one another and develop ideas out of that. And I think this has been extremely valuable, has been extremely helpful to navigating the pandemic, and could be even more helpful in the future. So I hope we do more of that. I'm grateful that you, Cristóbal, and your colleagues at the bank and the OECD did that. But the beauty of this technology is that this is within the power of most people to organize a convening of this sort. It's extremely democratic. You don't need to be the World Bank. When I used to work at the World Bank, I was very happy because we had a video conferencing equipment. And 25 years ago, those things were so expensive that only organizations like the bank could have it. Nowadays, most people with an internet connection can do what we're doing. And I'm hoping that we're going to see much more dialogue, much more involvement, much more democratic participation of people of goodwill everywhere. Teachers, parents, students, principals, private sector, public sector, for the sake of building an education renaissance that we need. That's my final thought. I think we have the tools to actually mobilize the talent that we need to help us step up to the challenge.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you so much. Lucia?
I agree with Fernando. Being connected in hearts and minds are going to make it possible for us to dream for a new education. Hybrid learning, blended learning, but I think we are smart enough now to know that technology can be a great lever to help us to provide good quality education to all students in the world.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Leda?
Well, the pandemic, I think, made very evident, painfully evident, that we need to be a connected society, connectivity for everybody, and that schools as a place and the teacher there are important. What we need to do now is to make that a reality and to support teachers to be ready to use this connectivity and the digital technologies to really enhance educational changes.
Leda, Lucia, Fernando, you have been fantastic panelists. I wish we had more time, but when conversations are good, you always have the feeling that time has been rushing. Fernando started his introduction at the very beginning saying innovation, innovation, innovation. And I think part of the conversation now has been also exploring the idea of collaboration, collaboration, collaboration with openness and also with tolerance to people who have different perspectives. So we will keep the conversation going on the social media. I really thank to all of you for your time and participation. And on behalf of the World Bank, it has been a pleasure to co-host this panel. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Bye-bye.